Um, First time I've done this, really. Okay, there we are. That's my wife and myself when we're a little bit younger, had a bit more hair. They got 4 children. This is the oldest. His name is Robert, his wife Christabel, and they have a daughter called Charlotte. And haven't seen them for a little bit because we're socially isolating. So they come to visit us and look at us through the window, or we stand on the doorstep and they stand about 10 feet away and we chat. That's Jonathan and Irina. They live in Singapore now, so they've just started lockdown just a few days ago. Before that, they've still been working from home. There's Alexander. He's living in Norwich. He's also working from home, this internet sort of thing. And that's her daughter Elizabeth, who has decided to go. Anyway, she's staying with Robert and Charlotte at the moment, so that she doesn't, because she's been working, so she doesn't want to infect us in case she catches it. And she's also been looking after Charlotte while Robert and Christabel have been working from home, so that's been quite helpful for them. And here we are. We go on holiday every summer, and that's one of the holidays we went to about 2 years ago, I think, down in the south of France. So that's my family. All right, so this is what we're going to be looking at today and tomorrow. It's called Learning from Moses. So I teach a Divine Principle workshop every Easter, as you know, and I think most of you have been to one of them. And so last year, as far as I remember, the last 2 years, I've been looking at some of the Genesis stories. That's Adam's family and Noah's family and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. I've been looking at those stories. So as you know, those of you who come to my workshops, I try and teach something different every workshop. I don't want to go through the whole of the Divine Principle in one go, because it's too abstract and too overwhelming. And it's much better just to go through some parts of it in detail. So I thought, sort of following on from last year, would start moving on to look at the stories of Moses, and then tomorrow and the day after Jesus. So let's have a look at this. Easter HARP Workshop 2020. So, to say there. So a little bit about stories. You might wonder, why do we look at stories so much? So stories are very important in our lives. If you don't know the trees, you may be lost in the forest. But if you don't know the stories, you may be lost in life. Really? Somebody's written that. Okay. Interesting. All right. You may be lost in lives. It's often stories which enable us to understand ourselves and our country and our family and where we come from. So if you listen to family stories, it helps you to understand who you are, why your family is living, where it's living, where your parents came from, why your parents are the way they are. Because sometimes your parents may not have come from the same country in which you're living. You might wonder, well, why are they like that? And if you go to the country where your parents come from, then you realize, oh, that's why my mum, or that's why my dad is like that. And then you begin to understand your story. So another reason I like stories is because they give people enough space to think for themselves. You can, when you read a story, when you read a novel, you can enter into the characters of the different novel, and it creates space within yourself to think about all the different characters in the novel, all the different storylines, what they're doing, how they're reacting, how they're feeling. And it creates that kind of space to think for yourself and develop your own imagination. And this is a Christian novelist. He said, perhaps it's how we're made. Perhaps words of truth reach us best through the heart, and stories and songs are the language of the heart. So often it's like many of the greatest teachers, like Jesus, they taught through stories, not just abstract truths, but they taught through stories. They're the most powerful ways of explaining things. And this is Terry Pratchett. Some of you might have read some of his novels. People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. In fact, in many ways, the stories that we read, they shape our inner world and our inner life. The fairy stories we hear when we're growing up, lots of stories that we hear, they furnish our inner mind in many ways. So this is another children's author. He said, the stories we tell literally make the world. If you want to change the world, you need to change your story. So when we think about ourselves, often we have within our head, running around most of the time, a story about who we are and the things that happened yesterday or the day before yesterday or last week or last year. We have a lot of these stories running around in our heads. And it's this story which is the way in which we see ourself, our place in a story, and all the different characters around us and the things that have happened to us. And sometimes people get stuck. And sometimes when you listen to people, they just say the same thing over and over again. Whereas if we want to change ourselves or change our world, we need to change our story. Sometimes we need to go back and look at our life and to reevaluate it and to change the way in which we see our life and change the way in which we tell our story and see what lessons we can have learned from the things that have happened in our past. And then it helps us to change ourselves and to change the world in which we're living. All right, so let's have a look at Moses' story then. So a bit of background. So first of all, who is Moses? So who is Moses? Well, Moses is the person who led the Hebrews, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So, well, you might wonder, well, who are the Hebrews or Israelites? So who are the Hebrews? Well, the Jewish people, they speak Hebrew. That's their language. But the Hebrews then, they were descendants of Jacob, who is also known as Israel. So when Jacob had a wrestle with the angel, then the angel gave Jacob a new name, and that name was Israel, which meant he struggled and wrestled with God and with man and been successful. He hadn't given up. So what were they doing down in Egypt then? Well, Jacob took them down there during a famine. So there's a big famine in Egypt, and during this famine, Joseph, he sent his sons down into Egypt, and eventually they all moved down to Egypt because his son Joseph had actually saved the people of Egypt from this famine. A little sip of water. So when was all this going on? About 1,600 years before Christ. So this is about 3,500 years ago. All these events were taking place. Okay, it's a long time ago. So what was life like in Egypt when they were living down there? Well, this is his family. Jacob's family took them down to Egypt, and they lived in this place called Goshen. Supposed to live there. So you can see some of the remains of some of the statues that are there. And while they were there, they prospered and multiplied. They did very well, became very successful. But after a couple of hundred years, a new king came in Egypt, and he didn't know who Joseph was. He didn't know who the Hebrews were. He didn't know why all these foreigners were living in Egypt. He didn't know that Joseph was the one who, through his economic policies, had actually saved the people of Egypt from a famine. But he didn't know that. He forgot that. That's why it's so important to understand and to know history, because otherwise we see something and we can't understand, why are these people living here? Yeah, so he became very suspicious of them and wanted to, and thought these foreigners might take over their country. And so what he did, he wanted to try and solve this problem, which he saw as being a problem. And he wanted to turn all the people of Egypt, all the Israelites, the Hebrews, into slaves. So how did he do that? Well, first of all, he employed them all as builders, making bricks and building. You can see that's an old picture discovered, which was from around about that time, making bricks and building things. And then from employing them, he turned them into forced labor. So he reduced their wages, and he made them work, even though he wasn't paying them very much. And eventually they were reduced to slavery. They had to do the work. They no longer were free. They were property of the Pharaoh. He owned them. So it meant they had no freedom. They just had to follow orders. And the most important virtue for slaves is to be obedient. So the Pharaoh, he wanted people who would just follow his orders and follow his instructions and just do as they were told. Their obedience then became very important for them. And he set them to building projects. So some of these projects are Ramesses and Pithom, which were cities. And then, well, where did Moses come in then? Well, he was the son of Amram, who was his dad, and Jochebed was his mum. Amram was the leader of the synagogue, so he was one of the community leaders there. And then when the Hebrews started multiplying, then the Pharaoh ordered all the baby boys to be put to death. He told all the midwives, if the Hebrews have a baby boy, you have to strangle or drown the baby boy and only let the girls live. So what to do in this situation? It's an awful situation. So what are the people going to do? So Amram and the other community leaders, they thought, it's terrible if all the boys, all our sons are put to death. What should we do? And so Amram, the community leaders, they decided, well, maybe we just shouldn't have any more children. It's not fair for children to be born and then for half of them to be killed. But then what happens? Then you end up with no community at all. So some very brave women in Moses' life that intervened. So the first was his sister Miriam. She said to her dad, look, Dad, what your policy is even worse than the Pharaoh's. Because if we carry on like this and have no children, we will just become extinct. So she pleaded with her father, and her father said, okay, it's all right to have children. And so Jochebed, that's Moses' mother, gave birth to Moses at the risk of her life. And she knew that the midwives normally would kill him, so she took him and put him in a basket on the River Nile, and he floated. So the reality is then that the baby boys weren't being put to death. So when the Pharaoh heard about this, he was really angry, and he called the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, they were two women, and said to Shiphrah and Puah, why aren't you killing the baby boys? Why are the baby boys still being born and growing up? The Hebrews. And the midwives, they lied, and they said to Pharaoh, oh, the Hebrew women, they have their children so quickly before we can even get there. But the reality is that the midwives, they felt, no, it's not right to kill babies. We wanted to become midwives so we could help mothers and bring babies into the world. The last thing they would want to do would be to kill these little boys. And so they decided they're going to disobey the Pharaoh. They weren't going to kill the baby boys that are born. And so the first example of what you might have learned about at school, called civil disobedience, was these women. They refused to obey the Pharaoh, even at the risk of their life, because the Pharaoh could obviously put them to death. But they decided it was more important to follow their conscience than to obey the Pharaoh. So this idea then that there are moral limits to power. Just because a person's the king or the Pharaoh, it doesn't mean that they can do whatever they want to. There are moral limits to what anybody can do. Right is not right. Justice is more important than law. Anyway, so Miriam, that's Moses' sister, she floated Moses on the River Nile. And then the Pharaoh's daughter came along and she saw this baby in a basket. And she told her servants to go and bring the baby out of the basket. And so the Pharaoh's daughter then, as the Pharaoh's daughter, she also should have drowned the baby or told one of her maids to drown the baby. But she had compassion on the baby. So out of compassion, she disobeyed her father, the Pharaoh. So again, at the risk of her life, she decided it's more important to save the baby's life and to bring this baby up as my own son than to obey my father. And so she gave Moses his name. So you can see the names of these incredibly brave and courageous women, they're all remembered in the Bible. Yeah, they're all there by name. And they're without them, Moses would not have been born. He would not have lived. Incredibly courageous people. All right, so Moses then, he grew up in the palace for 40 years. He didn't have a slave mentality, and he became very used to being a leader. But his mother was his nurse, and so she brought him up with a consciousness that even though the Pharaoh's daughter He'd been adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, but with the consciousness that he was a Hebrew. So he knew all the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He knew who he was and where he came from. And one day he went out for a walk, as it says in the Bible. What do you do when you face injustice? So one day, when Moses was a grown man, he went out to visit his relatives because he knew who his family were. And he watched them struggling at forced labor. So he watched his relatives who were having to do this forced labor. And he saw one day an Egyptian strike a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, maybe his cousin, don't know. He looked this way and that, and when he saw that no one was around, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. So that's the question, what was going on here? So it says here, he looked this way and that. So you can see here, a Hebrew who's beating, a slave driver is beating a Hebrew. So when you see someone doing that, what should you do? Obviously, it's not right that you should be doing that. Slave drivers shouldn't be treating people like that, because if you treat someone like that, they get injured and they can't work. So it says here that Moses looked this way and that. So he's looking around to see, is someone going to intervene? Obviously, this slave driver had a boss. So that Moses is wondering, is the boss of the slave driver going to intervene and tell the slave driver not to do this? Is there a policeman around who's going to say, you shouldn't be treating this person in this way? So he looked around, he saw no one was around. It wasn't that there was nobody there. Obviously, there's loads of people there. It's on a building site. But he realized no one was taking responsibility to stop this injustice from taking place. So he thought, well, I have to do it. If I don't intervene, nobody will intervene. And so it says here, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. I don't think he went and deliberately killed the Egyptian. I think probably he intervened and he may have pushed the Egyptian back, and the Egyptian may have fallen back, tripped up over a rock and cracked his head open and died. Something like that. That's probably what happened. I'm sure that's a better explanation than thinking, oh, he deliberately killed the Egyptian. I don't think that's the kind of person Moses was. So this is the kind of person Moses was. So he wasn't a bystander. What's a bystander? Sometimes you might have read in the newspapers that somebody gets attacked in the street and that in front of, and there's crowds of people walking along the street, or at least a lot of people walking along, and someone starts beating somebody up and people stand around and watch, but sometimes nobody intervenes or nobody stops it from happening. That's called a bystander. Yeah. So Moses then, he wasn't a bystander. So it says here, sometimes when bad things happen, some avert their eyes, they just walk past, they don't want to see it. Some wait for others to act, or why doesn't somebody else get involved and do something about it? Some blame others for failing to act, and some simply complain. So that's the reality. When something bad happens, we can see something bad happening either to us or in society. Sometimes we just ignore it and pretend it's not going on. And sometimes we think, oh, well, why doesn't somebody else solve it? We wait for somebody else to get involved and to do something about it. And sometimes we say, well, why didn't so-and-so do it? And blame others for failing to act. And sometimes, people just complain. Well, why doesn't the government do something about it? Or why doesn't our teacher do something about it? Why doesn't so-and-so do something about it? Okay. So a leader then is one who takes responsibility. Leadership is born when we become active and not passive. When we don't wait for someone else to act, because perhaps there is no one else, at least not here and not now. So that's what a leader is. A leader is someone who takes initiative and takes responsibility, takes the lead. And when someone starts to do that and takes the lead, then often other people will follow behind and will get involved as well. Does that make sense? There are some who say, well, if something is wrong, let me be among the first to put it right. They're leaders. They're the ones who make a difference in their lifetimes. They're the ones who make our world a better place. So that's a sort of consciousness which we want to have ourselves. A leader's not somebody who is appointed or given a position or given a role. A leader is someone who says, there's something wrong here. I'm going to try and make it better. And as soon as you start doing that, you'll find other people will get involved as well and want to be guided by you. So those are the kind of people that make a difference in the world. Sometimes people wait around thinking, oh, why doesn't somebody appoint me a leader? Well, that's not a leader. That's just someone who has a title or a position. A leader is someone who actually takes responsibility and other people follow their example. That makes sense? So with rare exceptions, God does not intervene in history. Sometimes people say, well, why doesn't God do something about it? Instead, God works through us, not to us. God wants us to take responsibility. And as soon as we do that, often we can find and feel God's presence inside us, working through us. So God doesn't want us to accept the world as it is. He wants us to be responsible and to change it. Okay, so obviously to do that requires a lot of prayer, to understand how to intervene and what's the best way to get involved. Okay, so what should have happened next? Well, what should have happened next is, according to the principle in the Bible, the idea if the people recognize, oh, Moses is our leader, let's support him, then they might have been able to leave then and go to Canaan in 21 days. I don't think that's so realistic myself. Canaan is the land of Israel. So what did happen? So next day, Moses was walking around the building site again, and he saw two Hebrews who were fighting with each other. And Moses said, you shouldn't be fighting with each other. And one of them said, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. So he realized that everybody knew that he killed this Egyptian. And he realized that the Egyptian police and authorities in the palace would find out as well that he would be arrested and maybe put to death himself, because they would think he was a traitor. So he decided he needed to flee, and so he fled, and he left Egypt, and he went to live in the wilderness of Midian. And when he arrived there, he went to a well because he was thirsty. And when he arrived at the well, he saw that there were some women there who were giving water to their sheep. And there were some men who'd come to harass the women and drive them away, and they were, sexually harassing them. And so again, Moses has to decide, what am I going to do? He could have thought, okay, it's nothing to do with me. I don't know who they are. I'm just going to wait till they all go away. Then I'll go and get a drink. But instead of that, he got involved, and he chased the men away, and he defended the women at the well. And then they said, oh, why don't you come home with us and meet our dad? So he went home and he met Jethro, who's the priest of Midian. And then he got married to Zipporah, who was one of Jethro's daughters. And they had 2 sons. And he became a shepherd. And so for the next 40 years, he was a shepherd looking after his father-in-law Jethro's sheep. So a particular kind of person, a shepherd, they're taking responsibility for themselves. There's no one around to tell them what to do. They're always having to take responsibility for their reality. So where's all this taking place? Well, this is Ramses. This is supposed to be the city that the Hebrews were building. And Goshen down here, where I'm making a circle, this is where they would have lived. And then Moses, he fled across the Sinai desert to Midian, which is down here. Yeah, and that's where Mount Sinai was later. That's where he was doing his shepherding. So after 40 years, then he had this extraordinary encounter with God. At this stage, he's 80 years old. And then one day he sees a burning bush, and he approaches the burning bush. Then out of the bush, he hears a voice. And the voice says, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So it's very interesting here. This is Moses' encounter with God. But it's also very interesting to see, how does God introduce himself to Moses? God doesn't say, I'm the creator of the universe. He doesn't say, I'm the mighty, almighty God who created the universe, and you have to do what I say. He doesn't say that at all. He says, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. In other words, I'm the God of your forefathers. I know your ancestors personally. I have a personal relationship. I'm the God who has a personal relationship with every single human being. And to God, that is more important for God, is that the God of every single individual human being, his children, than that he's the God that created the universe. So for God, it's not about power, it's about relationship. Yeah? And then God says, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering. So again, God doesn't say, I'm the God of power or I'm the God of knowledge. He says, I have heard my people suffering. I'm aware they're suffering. So he introduced, God says, I'm a God of heart. I care about my people who are suffering. Yeah, and I'm concerned about them. So again, through this, God reveals he's a personal God, wants to have a personal relationship with every single human being, but also that God cares about people when they're suffering, because it breaks God's heart to see people suffering, and he wants to intervene and stop that suffering in some way. Yeah, but obviously, he can only do that through people. He can only stop slavery when someone takes responsibility to stop it. And that's what he wants Moses to do. So it says to Moses, I'm concerned, I want you to go down into Egypt, and I want you to bring the people out of Egypt, out of slavery. Okay, so that's what God says. God says to Moses, I will send you to Pharaoh. And you're to say this to Pharaoh, you've got to let the people go. And Moses thinks to himself, why should Pharaoh pay any attention to me? Who am I to do that? Who am I to lead the people out of Israel? So Moses then, he doesn't have very much self-confidence, obviously. But God says, don't worry, I'll be with you. And Moses thinks to himself, that's not very helpful. Why isn't it very helpful from Moses' point of view? It's because God is invisible. So Moses says, okay, you're going to be with me, that's nice. But then they'll ask me, what is your name? And so God says, my name is Yahweh. I go on being as I go on being. God is alive. God is active being. God is always a free being. And Moses says, they won't believe me. I can go and tell the people that, but they won't believe me. So Moses didn't have faith in himself, which really isn't such a problem, because it's not good to be overconfident. But he should have. It's important that he should have faith in the people of Israel. It's important for him as a leader to have faith in the people he's to lead. But he didn't have much faith in the Hebrews because of the earlier experience he'd had with them. Yeah, when he'd killed the Egyptian and they just spread rumors about him, he didn't have very much confidence that they would. Yeah. Anyway, so Moses says, look, God, I'm not eloquent because he stuttered. He wasn't able to give powerful speeches. I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and of tongue. In other words, who's going to pay any attention to me? I'm not a good speaker. But God said, I'll be in your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. And Moses thought, oh God, look, man, look, God, I'm 80 years old. I'm in retirement. Can't you find somebody else? There must be a better person than me you can find to send. Now, at this point, God lost his patience with Moses and said, look, what about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well. So you whisper into your brother's ear what he should say, then he can give the big, loud speech in your place. And so Moses says, all right, okay, I'll work together with my brother. So Moses then, he worked together with his older brother and his older sister Miriam. So he realized he cannot do it by himself. He needs to work together as a team. So Moses and Aaron and Miriam, they form a team. So it's the first time that brothers function as a team. So their partnership, Moses and Aaron and Miriam, is like a constant feature in the whole story. And as long as they're working together, things work well because they're working as a team. So it's really important then, as a leader, you realize actually you can't do everything by yourself. It's really important to have a team of people you can trust completely. And he was able to win the love and respect of his older brother, Aaron, and also to win the love and respect of his older sister, Miriam. So, he was a good younger brother. So then they went down to Egypt. And again, before you do something, you have to have everybody's support. So Moses realized, well, I can't just go to Pharaoh together with Aaron and say, let the people go, because he's going to say, well, do they want to leave? So Moses and Aaron then realized we need to get support of all the people. So he brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs of a few little miracles before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped, because they realized God cared. Yeah, because they realized God cared, they realized God loves us, and they worship God. Then Moses went to the Pharaoh, and he said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Israel's my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me. So again, this is interesting. God says, Israel's my firstborn son. So right from page 1 of the Bible, there is this understanding that God is the God of every single human being. It's not that God is the God of the people of Israel and nobody else. It's not God is the God of the Jews and nobody else. God says, I'm the God of everybody. But Israel is my firstborn son. So it means the people of Israel, I've chosen them to have an extra responsibility. They're my firstborn son, chosen for a particular responsibility, a particular mission, but actually everybody, including the Egyptians, are also my sons. Yeah. So I just wanted Israel, the people of Israel, to go and worship for 3 days. The Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should pay attention to him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, I'll not let Israel go. And so instead, the Pharaoh said to his officials, make the Hebrews work harder. And so when Moses went back to the elders, they said to him, may the Lord look upon you and judge you. You've made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. So Pharaoh and the officials, the Egyptian officials, were making the Hebrews work even harder than they were working before and making their lives a real misery. So Moses then, it didn't work out well. It failed. Sometimes you think, okay, I'm going to go and do it. And then when we first start doing something, it's a failure. Yeah. Pharaoh didn't let the people go, and the Israelites, the leaders, were upset with Pharaoh, with Moses. So Moses turned to God and said, look, God, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh, speaking in your name, he's brought trouble upon this people, and you've not rescued your people at all. So Moses then, he's really disappointed. He's failed. But the thing about Moses is he didn't allow this failure to define him. He didn't think, oh, I failed, therefore I'm a failure. He said, okay, I failed, but I'm going to pick myself up and have another go. And I remember Winston Churchill said, being successful means going from one failure to another without losing, without giving up. Yeah. So Moses failed over and over again, but didn't allow his failures to define him as a failure. He just learned from the mistakes he made. He learned from the failures, picked himself up, and thought, okay, where do we go from here? And that's a really important lesson. Anybody who tries to do something with anything, when you first start doing anything, it always goes wrong because you don't have any experience. We don't have any knowledge or understanding. And it's very easy when everything goes wrong to just give up. Yeah, well, that's what we have to learn from how things have gone wrong, not make the same mistake again. And sometimes you just make lots and lots of mistakes, but eventually you get there. Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb, he said, I found 9,000 ways how not to make a light bulb. And after about 9,000 or 10,000 attempts, finally he was able to make the first light bulb. But he said he found 9,999 ways how not to make a light bulb. Does that make sense? And that's what it is. And that's what, in our own life, we should be learning Okay, it hasn't gone wrong. My exams I failed my exams. Okay, where do I go from here? Okay, obviously I need to learn that. I didn't learn it enough. I didn't study that hard enough. Okay, I'm going to have another go. Sometimes you fail a driving test. You can easily just give up. Okay, obviously I need to study more. I need to learn more. I need to practice more until eventually I can pass it, or whatever it is in life. Anyway, so God said to Moses, "You're to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you." So this is interesting. God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart. So let's have a look and see what that means. So there was this series of plagues. There were the 10 disasters that befell Egypt. They're recorded here in the Bible. First of all, there was a plague of blood. Then it says a plague of frogs. Then a plague of lice. Then a plague of flies. Then a plague of all their cows and cattle dying. Then a plague of boils on the skin. Then a plague of hailstorms. Then a plague of locusts that ate up all the crops. Then a plague of darkness, the sky was dark for 3 days. And then the firstborn of the Egyptians all died. And sometimes people wonder, well, did that really happen? Is it all made up? You know, it says that in the Bible, but is it true? Is that really what happened? And sometimes people say, well, the Bible's just made up. It's written down thousands of years later, and somebody just made up all these stories. And of course, there's also the ethical issues about this. So people have tried to think about this. And so this is one particular person who I came across. He's Professor Colin Humphries. He used to be the Goldsmith Professor of Material Science at Cambridge University, a very eminent scientist, and also Professor of Experimental Physics at the Royal Institution in London. And he was a Christian, and he read the Bible, but he also wanted to understand, is it really true what happened? Did it literally happen like this, or has it all been made up? And so he did some research, and he wrote a book about the miracles of Exodus to find a scientific basis for all these events. So there's a little video here. I'm going to try and show it. And if you can't hear me, let me know. See if I can get this to work. Which goes about this.
As in God, Moses, the whole deal. Well, that's great. All I need is one.
Over 3,000 years ago, in the time of the pharaohs, a series of catastrophes befell the land of Egypt. These events are told in the Old Testament book of Exodus. Could they have really happened? The story of the 10 plagues has fascinated and mystified scholars throughout the centuries. And this mystery has become irresistible for scientists who want to explain what may at first seem inexplicable.
You find positions from across the spectrum, from those who take a very strict historical perspective that everything happened just exactly like it said in the text, to the other extreme where nothing that's talked about in the text actually happened, that it's legendary or some other such word. A number of us want to find our way between those two extremes.
The Bible is a very strange book in lots of ways. Even biblical scholars in the last 150 years have been emphasizing how very strange it is, because for one thing, it's not one kind of literature. It's many, many different kinds of literature. It's poetry, short story, history in part, chronology.
When we're beginning to plan out an investigation, what you do is say, let's first of all see what it is that we have to explain. About 10 years ago, I happened to read a letter in the British journal called The Lancet, in which alluded to the 10 plagues of Egypt. And I wondered if anyone had bothered to look at rational explanations for each of the 10 plagues.
Well, I got really interested in the Exodus story because I'm a believer and I'm also a scientist. I thought, well, science has got a real input to make here because the Bible's describing as natural events, extraordinary natural events. And so I thought, can there be scientific explanations behind these events?
It's a mystery as to, did this story really happen just like this?
The eruption of Santorini was one of the biggest eruptions in the last 2,000 years. It ejected something like maybe 25 cubic miles of debris into the atmosphere, and it definitely affected the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's no doubt about that. It is known that the ash found in the area of the Nile comes from Santorini because chemically the composition is identical to the composition of the ashes found on the remains of Santorini itself. So you've had this steady build-up of activity over a period maybe of months, and that could have led to a range of phenomena occurring in Egypt. The fallout may have caused the river water to change its composition in some way to allow algae to grow, an algal bloom which could have been reddish in colour.
There's a modern phenomenon called a red tide. What it is, it's due to algae, which if the conditions are right, they can bloom and they turn a bright red colour, and some of them emit toxins. These are called harmful algae, and these harmful algae will kill fish.
The next group of plagues, if you like, the frogs and the lice and the flies, maybe they're all related to some problem with the ecosystem caused by the impact of the eruption on the river.
Fish were and are a major check on the ecosystem. So if you have tadpoles that are allowed to mature, you may have a massive explosion of amphibians.
Uneaten eggs turned into record numbers of baby frogs who subsequently fled to the land and died. Their little rotting frog bodies attracted lice and flies.
The Aramaic term for lice could have been any small biting insect, anything.
By looking at the science of what happens and looking what the subsequent plagues are, we can come to what this particular gnat was, and it was a biting midge.
This biting insect affected both humans and animals, suggested that the insect involved was not a louse. A human flea doesn't bite a dog, and a dog flea doesn't bite a human. The same is true of lice. If you begin to look at the sequence about the fish dying and the frogs proliferating, the frogs dying and the midges, then you would have an environment in which there would be a lot of proteinaceous decaying matter, which would allow a fly to also proliferate into massive swarms. The question is, what kind of flies?
Stable flies swarm, and they're really unpleasant because they bite. And not only do they bite, their bite leaves open wounds on human flesh and on animal flesh. Now, the fifth plague was the death of the livestock.
The lice carried the blue tongue virus, which killed 70% of Egypt's livestock.
So the biting midge, which is the third plague, can give rise to the fifth plague of the death of the livestock, and these specific livestock.
This explained boils and blains, not just one thing, boils and blains, affected the Egyptians and their animals.
I believe that was called by the fourth plague, which was a plague of flies, because the stable fly inflicts painful bites, which when infected, they lead to boils. So it fits beautifully together. So the fourth plague led to the sixth plague.
This is potentially quite easy to explain in the context of a volcanic eruption, because when you have a huge amount of ash pumped into the atmosphere, the ash acts as nuclei for water droplets to form, and those water droplets, if they're carried high enough up, will freeze and they will form hailstones. So torrential rainstorms and hailstorms during volcanic eruptions are not at all uncommon.
After the plague of hail was a plague of locusts. They only happened some years, And they only happen when locusts find damp ground in which to lay their eggs. And the ground has to be very damp because they lay their eggs 4 inches deep in the sand. This hailstorm was so severe, it would have drenched the land when the hailstones melted. And so I believe this is what attracted the locusts. The locusts came down, they laid their eggs, and then those locusts would just swarm there. They just ate all the remaining grain, which the hail itself hadn't damaged.
Okay, let's see. So I'm not going to show the next part because it's time to stop the lecture. Well, for me, that was really interesting because you can see that, you know, there's an act, when you look at it, you can see that what's recorded in the Bible is an accurate record of an ecological catastrophe that took place. That volcano at Santorini, at the same time as Exodus was supposed to happen. Now you can see that would have caused the Nile to go red, that would have killed the fish, that would have led to the frogs, etc., etc. So when I read that, I see, wow, that means the people who wrote the Bible, there was obviously somebody there who saw all these things happening, and they accurately recorded this series of events. You know? But they didn't know what was causing it. They didn't know the volcano had erupted because there's no TV in those days. They didn't know one thing led to another thing. And so they attributed it to God. They said, God sent this or God sent that. Okay, that's their interpretation, but actually it was a series of natural events and natural catastrophes, and they interpreted it in that way. But when I read that, I realize, well, that's an accurate record, the only accurate record we actually have of those events that took place 3,500 years ago, which is connected to this volcanic eruption. So when I see that, I realize, well, that means most of what's written in the Bible is probably an accurate representation, accurate record of the things that people saw and experienced. That make sense? So I thought, oh, that's interesting. You know, if that's an accurate record of these natural phenomena that took place, then, well, maybe the rest of the story is also an accurate record of what people remembered as having taken place. And of course, on top of that, there's their interpretation of why it took place or what was going on. Okay, so I think it's time for me to stop now, 7 minutes past 2. So what should I do here? I'll stop my share and I'll hand it back to Sam. Is that okay?